What is critical media literacy?
Okay. So critical media literacy is really, more than anything, an attempt to reframe our understandings of literacy. It's about recognizing that in the 21st century, to be able to read and write requires much more than what was necessary back, 500 years ago or even 10 years ago. And so the two goals of critical media literacy really are: one, expanding our understanding of literacy to include more forms of information communication, from advertising to pictures to movies to podcasts, all of these. So when we talk about literacy, we're no longer just talking about being able to read letters on a page, so that we're moving beyond the old notions of print literacy to this more multimodal idea that all the different ways we communicate are literacy. And we need to be able to read and make sense of this information. We need to be able to create with this information. So on one level is this kind of horizontal expansion of literacy to include every way we communicate. The other idea is kind of this vertical deepening of education to recognize that information and power are always connected. And so looking at the ways that information influences, shapes, is shaped by, and perpetuates ideas and thinking is really key, because some people still kind of hold on to the old notions that information is neutral, that media are objective. And it's really important to move beyond that, to recognize that everything has a bias because everything's created by human beings. And just having a bias isn't bad, but we need to interrogate and ask questions about those biases and about the construction of our information, so that we acknowledge that it's always political. It's always supporting or challenging ideas.
Sounds perfect. Okay, so we were talking about critical media literacy. So, and when people think of literacy, they think of reading and writing.
Right.
But when you add the critical media literacy, critical media part, what are you trying to tell parents? That they need, that reading and writing is not enough?
Well, reading and writing is enough, but reading and writing just letters on a page is not enough. So what we need to expand is our idea of what it means to read and write. Because if we're talking about the idea of being literate in the world, being able to understand and make sense of information and being able to communicate, well, we have to be able to do that with more than just letters and print, because that's how the majority of people get their information. Social media, movies, TV, video games, all these things are forms of communication that all the same rules of literacy apply to, but it's much more than just that book and those letters on the page.
Yeah, and I was actually subbing for a class, and they were hooked on TikTok. They were more interested on TikTok than the lessons. I mean, the teacher did give them like paperwork, and she was tired. She was done with it. And in the class, they would just play video games.
Right.
There was a game that it was almost like Fortnite with tanks. And I was thinking, wow, and she was so burnt out. She was like, she didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
And
that's real unfortunate.
I think it's very common. You'll see that a lot in the classrooms.
Yeah.
The teachers don't know what to do.
Right.
Because they're fighting with curriculum that they need to execute, or these agendas, the scores, the measurements, and standardization, but kids aren't interested. They're more interested on their phones,
Sure.
which is not a phone. They're interested in communicating with their friends. They're interested in TikTok,
Right.
dancing in front of TikTok and getting likes, and they're interested in working together online.
Sure. And it's very attractive. I mean, the cell phones give you access to everything, anyone in the world. I mean, it's an amazing power. They're mini computers. So we can't compete with them. And so if we can't compete with them, we can't beat them, then we need to figure out how can we best engage with them. And one thing we need to do is help students think more critically about them, getting them to ask more critical thinking questions, about the engagement they're already doing with these tools. The other thing is to help them think and find ways to be able to use these tools for positive purposes, for learning the academic content they're learning, or even better, for being able to communicate and contribute to society in responsible ways. And so I think one of the things we need to do is not fear and not try to censor against these tools, these electronic
games.
Yeah, sure. Some of them definitely are games. And so it's not about having a fighting relationship. We don't want to be antagonistic with them. We want to be critical with them, and we want to engage with them. We want to co-opt them instead of allowing them to co-opt us.
That's interesting. I mean, the thing about it is with you tell students, oh, I want to teach you how to be critical, think critical. And that's one of the questions I want to ask you. You hear critical this, critical that, critical race theory. But when you hear it all the time, critical pedagogy, critical cultural, critical reflection. So what can you define critical?
So the term critical is defined and used by a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. Some people use critical just simply to say, they're doing something a little bit more than they would otherwise. There are a lot of people who say critical thinking is just kind of the ability to, understand a passage that you're reading. The approach that I take to critical, when I'm talking about critical media literacy, comes from years of research in terms of critical theory. And critical theorists equate critical with an analysis of power. And that's really kind of the key component of critical, is that it's an interrogation of power and hierarchies of power. And so when we're talking about critical media literacy, we're asking questions about who's controlling the messages, who's influencing, who has the power, and who doesn't. So one of the big questions we ask is who's benefiting from this message and who's not, who's losing out or being hurt by this message. Getting at the big idea that messages are not neutral, that there's always an element of power in play.
Yeah, I mean, see, I like that. I like because before I never really questioned power because I was scared to, and I felt powerless. And that's why I like when you talked about intersectionality. I mean, you didn't coin the term. Kimberly Crenshaw did,
right.
And we talk about that at LMU. And you talk about something that you talk about standpoint theory, which comes from feminism. But I really like that. Can you explain that?
Sure. So feminist standpoint theory evolved from many different feminist scholars, Patricia Hill Collins, Sandra Harding, and others. And the idea is recognizing that people in the marginalized positions who have the least power more often than not have the ability to see and to understand the systems and structures of power that operate because they're living and experiencing the negative impact of it. So typically what happens when you're in a privileged position where you're benefiting from a situation, you don't recognize the structures of power. And oftentimes you internalize the idea that whatever benefits you have, you're getting because of your own meritocracy, your own efforts, that it's all because of me. So oftentimes we'll see, rich white men think they pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps and were not influenced by anyone else, without recognizing that there are these systems inherent that have been built into society that are giving them advantages all along the way that other people who don't look like them, who don't have their privileges, are not receiving, and they're not getting the same abilities to access what these wealthy white men are. And so standpoint theory is saying what we should do with any research or any investigation we're doing is just starting. The position from where we start at is key. If we start from a marginalized position, we're more likely to learn about the structures than if we start in the dominant position. And so an example could be a reporter doing a newscast about the war. And instead of starting by going to the civilians who are being affected by the impact of the war, they go to the general first. They interview the general, and the general lays out his framework, his understanding, and his questions. So then the journalist then goes to the civilians, but asks the civilians the questions that the general has set up. Very different story than if you start first with the civilians, find their perspective and take those questions to the general and ask him that. You're still going to two different sources, but the place that you start at is going to change very much the whole direction of that story.
Yeah, so that's interesting because whoever tells a story has their own perspective.
Right.
And in the general's view, it's much different than the people who are being affected by war. But so it's from the position of being marginalized. But how would you engage in research in that as a person who's been marginalized or a person who's historically marginalized? From their perspective, they might not understand the different structures that are around them that impede on their progress or impede on their happiness in general. Right. So how can they go about understanding these structures?
Right. No, and an important thing that the standpoint theorists argue is that it's not simply just because you start in a marginalized position doesn't mean that's going to give you the answers to everything that's going to explore the structures. It's not that at all. But what they argue is that the likelihood increases. The likelihood that a person of color is going to understand racism is greater than a white person understanding racism, right? The likelihood that a woman is going to understand patriarchy better than a man gets at the idea, because once you're experiencing the negative impacts, you have more insight into the effects of the impact because you're living it in body, through your body, right? So that's just the starting point. It's not the final answer. So what I would suggest for a teacher to do, if you're looking at any type of issue, is trying to start that research with your students from a marginalized position. So if you're teaching the students about manifest destiny, don't start reading about the colonizers and the colonists. Start by reading stories from the indigenous people. See their perspective first, and then read about the colonists. But then you're going to have a whole different set of questions that you're going to want to look at and explore, and that's going to help you see the bigger structures that are working, as opposed to first reading about Andrew Jackson and the people who were in charge. They're going to have a very different lens and questions that they're going to suggest. Asking why were the Indians so lazy? Why were all of these kind of negative stereotypes, as opposed to just simply changing where you start your investigation.
So you think that we need to see different angles of the story, or different perspectives, and how we get there to triangulate, rather than to just come from one view.
It's not just seeing different perspectives. Okay. That absolutely isn't essential, and triangulating is a very important tool. But what standpoint theory is saying, we're not just looking for different perspectives, but we're making sure and being very strategic to start the search of different perspectives from perspectives that are most harmed, marginalized, othered, exploited, hurt. By going there first, that's going to hopefully help us see a little bit better in terms of the structures of power.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting because a lot of people are, even students, they see their parents struggling, and sometimes they don't even understand why. And the parents don't understand why.
Right.
And for a long time, I didn't understand why. And I heard a word called cultural hegemony. And I was like, what? This means something. And it took me a long time to even understand the word. Hegemony. I couldn't, but I felt it.
Right.
I felt it deep inside. And
yes. And it's that feeling that Standpoint's all about. It's all about going to where that feeling is being experienced and letting people talk about that feeling, and then going to other perspectives to try to understand better, why are these people feeling this feeling where other people are not having that feeling. And one of the things, like you mentioned about hegemony and ideology, is that this stuff's not easy. It's not something you can hold in your hand and say, here, I've got hegemony in my hand. It's invisible. But just because it's invisible doesn't mean it's not real. It's very real. These structures are embedded throughout everything, for our laws, our language, just the words we use, right? So it's this thing that's inaccessible, and yet at the same time, it's everywhere. It's like the Matrix. This is what shapes our society and puts us into the these boxes where then we have to work from these positions that we've already been told, you are less, not as smart, you're inferior, and, you just have to be more humble and keep trying harder, and because the whole notion of meritocracy.
That's the myth of meritocracy.
Yes,
because there's
exactly.
a lot of hard-working people,
Right.
that don't get to those positions
That's
of power.
right.
And that's the myth. People say, well, you got to work hard. Well, there's people working hard.
What's harder than working out in the field, bending over, picking grapes?
That's hard work. There's people out there that work hard
Absolutely.
every day.
Yes.
And we see them every day. Jeff Bezos is not working hard. He's flying to space. I mean, there's differences when people say you got to work hard. That's the reason why you are oppressed, because you're not working hard enough. I just get very angry when I hear that.
Sure.
A lot of people use that.
Absolutely. Well, it's the myth of meritocracy, like you were saying. It's this deficit thinking that poor people are poor because it's their own fault. And that's very, convenient for rich people who are not to simply shift the blame onto the poor, because that removes the blame from themselves and from the structures that have given them the benefits. Because rich people don't want to think that they were given handouts. They want to think they did it all by themselves. And the reality is nobody does anything by themselves. We're all working within these different systems. And some systems are explicitly helping certain people and explicitly hurting other people.
Yeah, and some systems want certain people to be exploited.
Absolutely. Well, capitalism is built on a pyramid, right? Because if everybody had the amount of money that Jeff Bezos had, who's going to work in the fields? I mean, he makes so much extraordinarily, huge sums of money that it's compared to his workers, it's completely unjust.
Yeah, but it's the language that people use that's very hurtful, because it's not well thought out. It's something that we use to hurt. When say, well, you got to work harder, or you're complaining. We're not oppressed. We're not oppressed. You just have to work harder. You're complaining about. Right. But if there's a problem with the system, which there's problems everywhere, and you see the effects of racism and capitalism. But how does standpoint theory connect to critical media literacy?
So I think this is an important part of critical media literacy, because it helps us understand thought systems, epistemologies, and the ways we make sense of the world. Because we do all of this through language, through images, through symbols. It's how we communicate. And critical media literacy is about communication. And it's about asking questions about these words and symbols and representations that are shaping our ideas about the world, about who we are, and about who are other people. And so through a more sociological lens, one of the first things we need to do before we can make change is we need to be able to look up and see what are the strings pulling us, so that we can then cut those strings. We need that power first to recognize what's at play here.
Yeah, and teachers, I think, understand that a lot of the students, the constant social media, the marketing, it does change their perspective on themselves.
It shapes us.
Yeah, it shapes us. Their worldview is influenced, directly influenced through
all of us.
Yeah,
and a lot of times, one of the things that I try to do as often as possible is really reflect on my own positionality, my culture, my experiences, my assumptions, to try to figure out where am I messing up? Where am I not seeing how my actions are contributing to the problems?
Yeah, teachers also have to reflect on what their belief systems and their positionality as well.
Right.
Because it does shape them too, and their perspective of their students.
Right. And a lot of times we don't think about that, we don't see it. And we go along with this myth that, media is neutral and education is not political, which is bullshit,
Yeah. Hey, no cursing.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's fine. But yeah, you do have 5 points in your book that you talk about, which I don't know if we have time to go into. But what do you think a teacher could do right now to implement critical media literacy in their classroom?
Well, I think there's a lot of things. One of them is, like I was saying before, is try to change their thoughts about literacy. Recognize, one, that literacy is much more inclusive than just print. So when they're teaching whatever it is, bringing in videos, bringing in music, bringing in all the different art forms and the different ways we communicate, so that the students are learning about whatever the content is through different mediums, and also having the students respond to this, not by only either taking a test or writing an essay, but also by having them create different types of media, like a podcast like this, having them create videos, digital stories, memes, TikTok videos. I mean, there's so many different ways for communicating. So increasing that, if teachers can do that. But then the other key part that we've been talking about in terms of critical is getting them to ask these questions. You know, in the newer book that I have, we list 6 questions, and basically having the students ask, well, who created this? How did they create it? How could different people think about it? What are different values or ideologies that are embedded in the message or that are missing from the message? Asking about motivation. Why do you think this was created? And then ultimately, my favorite question is asking, well, who's benefiting from this and who's being harmed by this? Getting them to recognize that information is not just neutral, that there are always people that are either benefiting or being hurt by almost anything that we hear or see.
Yeah, and as social justice leadership, you know, how can they understand critical media literacy? I mean, how can a social justice leader implement, you know, my question, I'm trying to figure out this question.
Well, I think this is inherently about social justice because all our ideas come through representations.
Okay.
You know, there's very little we actually experience firsthand ourselves. Almost all our information about other people, about other places, comes through media, through either stories we hear, we see, television shows. And so it's really important that we critique and question those messages that are coming in, because it's not just the content, but also the way the message is put together that ends up putting us in a certain position to think about that message. So if we're watching, you know, something about the COVID vaccine, the vaccines that are coming out, whoever's telling us that information, it's probably through something we're reading or hearing or watching on some multimedia format. That's being shaped, the way it's being filmed, the way what's being edited and shared with us, and not who's speaking, who's not speaking. All of those are informing and constructing our ideas about that vaccine.
Yeah, I mean, everything can be photoshopped, and any message can be skewed for a certain campaign. Right now, I know about marketing because I have a certificate in marketing. So Google has micro moments. You know, they track everything that people do. So they call it micro moments, and they say that people access their phone 150 times per day. So they have a lot of data on people. And, you know, I think with kids and phones, marketers see, wow, this is great. You know, I can market kids right at school.
Right. Right.
I can market kids right at school, and I could have them have an association or to a commodity or to a product that will live with them for a lifetime.
Right.
You know, I mean, we grew up watching TV, all those commercials, the soda commercials, the smoking commercials, even candy, right. M&Ms, Nike.
So, right. So companies spend millions and millions of dollars on advertising, and they're businesses, and no business is going to waste millions and millions of dollars if they didn't think it was working. So advertising is a powerful tool to push people to do something, and that something is often purchasing, but they're also, you know, propaganda is being used to shape behaviors, right? Voting, everything.
Okay, so let's see. My last question was, what was my last question? Oh yeah. Well, first of all, you know, from a photojournalist perspective, you know, you say that everyone's a photographer, and the truth is, like, I think a lot of people of color who especially like with George Floyd, if that wasn't filmed, you know, that was a powerful video.
Right.
But if it wasn't filmed, there wouldn't be a lot more as much sympathy for George Floyd or
Right, exactly.
or yeah.
And there have been years and years, black men have been killed by the hands of white cops, and there's never been any accountability for that. And so George Floyd is an amazing example because it was filmed so well and it was documented and the whole world got to see, those 8 to 9 minutes. We were all there with them watching a white cop kill a black man. And that's the only reason there was outrage is because we had that video, because this shit's been going on for a long time.
No, it's been going on since the riots.
We can go back to slavery. I mean, this is part of the foundation of this country.
No, when I saw, I mean, it's amazing how video does inform a lot of people, but video could be, as a lot of people say, fake news could be manipulated. So being critical is very important,
right?
Because we don't know if it is real. Like you
right.
talked about deep fake. You talked about artificial intelligence getting really smart.
Right.
So a lot of kids they just accept. There's a threshold of exploitation. They'll just accept it because it's there.
Right.
They'll believe it's real.
Right.
So
and that's one problem, and that's a real problem, is the difficulty of knowing what to believe. I think a bigger issue that we really need to address besides fake news is the stuff that passes as real news, because all information, all news is constructed and has bias. And the more we need to help students recognize and question all the information they're getting, because every piece of information is promoting some type of ideology or not, or it's either challenging it or it's promoting it. And this goes way beyond kind of what's true and what's not, to be asking about all our information. Is this reproducing patriarchy and misogyny? Is this challenging racist ideas? Is this reproducing, heteronormativity? All of these things are part of every message. And this, to me, is the bigger question that we need to help students start wrestling with, to recognize that all information is positioning them in some way.
Yeah, and some people will say, well, because there's people who say, oh, it's cancel culture, or we have the right to say whatever we want to, but it's actually it's hurting a lot of people. It's hurting a lot of people. So my last question is, you say that environmental justice is social justice. So maybe you could talk about that.
Well, I think we need to recognize that we're living at a time right now of crisis. I mean, what's happening with the climate is not simply changing. It's not just simply climate change. This is a climate crisis where the world is heating up to a point it's never been before, in a speed, in a direction that is going to have devastating impact very soon. It already is in many places. We're seeing the fires, we're seeing the floods, we're seeing already the melting of the permafrost in the Arctic. And so these are issues that we need to address right now. And we also need to recognize that these are social justice issues, because what's happening to the environment is not happening to everybody equally. Environmental catastrophes and these problems are hurting and impacting the poorest and most marginalized communities the worst. It always has been that way. And so because of that, when we're talking about the climate crisis, we're looking at how the Southern Hemisphere, the poorest countries in the world, are being and will be, as it continues, harmed far worse than the Northern Hemisphere in the beginning. Eventually we'll probably all maybe disappear. I mean, this is, if it continues, if we don't do something right away to really start to shift our CO2 emissions, it's going to remove the possibility that humans can live on the planet. The planet will continue. It'll be fine, and it might even be better without us.
Yeah, of course.
But we're not going to be able to continue. And so what's going to happen in this process is that the poorest areas are going to be hurt the worst in the beginning. And that's the social injustice of this all. And we're seeing it already with climate refugees, people fleeing a lot of the developing countries because of the extreme temperatures, because crops are failing, because floods, and all of this is just going to increase far worse and worse. Where in the wealthier parts of the Northern Hemisphere, they're able to, put up bridges, build walls, do things temporarily to postpone and to not suffer as much in the beginning. So that to me is the social injustice.